Welcome to Green and Gold FC. We are joined here for a Soccer Anzacs pod by football historian Ian Syson and my regular co-host Alex. How you going, Alex?
I'm doing well, thank you. Lots of stuff to discuss today, and I can't lie, I've been in a better mood to discuss Australian football. I'm not exactly thrilled with the recent under-23 squad announcement, but excited to be back for another episode, and absolute pleasure to be joined by Ian as well.
And how you going, Ian?
I'm going well. I'm having a restful little period in my life, and I'm recovering from some health problems and feeling quite good, getting better.
That's good to hear. So let's get into the meat of the episode. Ian, why don't you tell us first a little bit about yourself and how do you become a football historian?
Well, I was an academic. I did my PhD in Australian literature, and I taught literature and writing and communication and sports writing as well at Victoria University for over 20 years. In my work, I enjoyed doing reviews, and I befriended Jason Steger at the age, and he gave me reviews to do. And then he asked me if I wanted to do football books, and that was around the 2006 mark. And I really enjoyed doing it, and he liked my reviews, and so I kept doing it. And I kind of realised I had something to give to the writing about the game, so I decided I would change my research track, if you like, from literature to football writing. So I in 2009, I was the writer in residence at Football Federation Victoria. But as it was my like sabbatical, I had my study leave. Started researching using Trove and other databases, and found this amazing history that was largely untold. And I published my book called The Game That Never Happened: The Vanishing History of Soccer in Australia in 2000. That was a book about the way in which the game had been so popular in different parts of Australia. It had flourished in the pre-World War One period so widely. It was the most widely played game in Australia, much more widely than rugby or Australian rules. And I thought, well, how come nobody knows this? And then the big thing that I found was became the Soccer Anzacs project. And I discovered that Australian soccer players participated quite strongly in the war. And I used to think around Anzac Day time, why are rugby league and Australian rules commemorating this fact, and we're not? So that spurred me to to research this stuff.
So, Ian, with the Soccer Ashes coming up, I think we all need to be a bit more informed as to the significance of this event. So do you mind just telling us all about the Soccer Ashes? Why should we get excited? Why should people care about this, supposed rivalry with New Zealand that stretches back, almost a century now in football terms? Why should people get excited about the revival of the Soccer Ashes?
Well, the Ashes, so named, not as a rip-off of the famous cricket Ashes, but the term Ashes was given to any sustained competition, sporting competition. And I've seen references to Australian rules Ashes in the goldfields in Western Australia, for example, in 1910 or whatever, that Kalgoorlie won the Ashes this year. So it's a general term. And so we used it for this important contest between Australia and New Zealand. And it contains ashes, and this feels a bit weird, but the cigar ashes smoked by both captains on the Queensland Test between Australia and New Zealand. The ashes were put into a razor case. Now, the razor case belonged to a guy called William Fisher, sorry, and he was the secretary of the Queensland Federation. He helped to row the boat, one of the first boats that landed on the 25th, the morning of the 25th of April in Gallipoli. He got on the beach before the shots were even fired because the Turks didn't realise anyone was coming. He got to safety of the cliff, and then he heard the shots, and people were starting to be shot behind him. So he was in a good position, I guess. And he had this razor case that was given to him to commemorate his enlistment, and he carried it with him all through the war, and he donated it to the trophy. So within the trophy, the physical trophy, is this razor case with the ashes, and the razor case is a relic of Gallipoli. So it's the real deal. What's important to me about the ashes is that it symbolises all of the soccer players who enlisted and fought and those who died. But it's also a symbol of growing recognition among the cohort of Australian soccer players who were playing games against other battalions and realising, so some Newcastle might realise that, hey, this players are from South Australia and they're playing football. What's going on? And then you've got this growing realisation that it's a national game. And it's a game that, as I said before, it covers more area than any other code of football. Soccer exists in every state. It exists in Geraldton, in Kalgoorlie. It exists in Hobart. It exists in Launceston, and even in Devonport. It exists in Wonthaggi. It exists in Mildura and Irimple. All around the nation, soccer teams, and the players learn that. The players in the war learn that fact. I think it's only my hope, a hypothesis at the moment, that the whole idea of an Australian national team is forged by the knowledge that's gained from the soldiers meeting other soccer soldiers.
Can you tell us a little bit about, just give us some numbers, just how many football players were there in Australia, or soccer players were there in Australia pre-World War One? What was the makeup of the league, and how many got drafted?
Yeah, no one was drafted. It's all volunteers. Pre-World War One, it's hard to know because all the records have been lost. But what we go by is the number of teams in existence and the way the game was reported in the media. And also, associations made claims about how many players they had. And we were going on the assumption that there were about 5,000 to 6,000 players in Australia before World War One, and we've made a further assumption that about a 70% to 80% of them enlisted, and so we're talking 3,000 to 4,000. That's a big chunk of people, and about 500 of them were killed. 500 players were killed, and some very good players were killed. There's a guy down here called Goodson. He was a brilliant centre half. He was an officer. He was killed very early, and many others were either killed or injured. So the game, if you like, it gave a lot to the war, and it really affected its continuity for all sorts of reasons.
So how do you estimate these numbers, that there's 70% and about 500 were killed?
Yeah, well, we've got a database up. We've got 800, nearly 800 players in the database, and we know that of those, 50 were killed at Gallipoli, right? So, but another 100 or maybe 150 were also killed elsewhere or died elsewhere, and we know that 70% figure because we look at the clubs, we look at their claims about who enlisted. Like one club, Merryweather Advance in Newcastle, it had 70 odd enlistments. Think how could they have had that many? Maybe a lot of those players were older players, I guess, people who had played for the club, but they made they did a roll of honour, and they had that many players on it. Adamstown had 28 players. Adamstown Rosebud still in the NPL in Newcastle. So basically, looking at all the data we can collect, and then making extrapolations and assumptions from that. We cannot make definitive claims yet because we still are compiling. We have about another, so we've got 800 up on the database, and I'll tell you what that is. It's socceranzacs.com.au, and we expect, we've got another 1,000 in waiting. We're waiting to write their biographies, and I won't survive to see the end of this project. It's an ongoing, long-term project, and but we'll get there. So, yeah, the numbers are intelligent estimations. Yeah.
So, Ian, in your opinion, would you say that the First World War came at a bad? Obviously, it would have come at a bad time for the growth of any sport in the nation, with large amounts of male enlistment for the war. Do you think that, I guess, fighting alongside the English to a certain degree, do you reckon that sort of helped embed a European game such as football in Australian culture at the time? Do you reckon maybe it was looked down upon at the time or anything like that? And overall, do you think that large amounts of enlistments would have had a major hindrance on the growth of the game at the time?
My initial assumption was that it would have hurt the game. That, killing players, players dying, players, leaving and getting injured and not being able to play when they came back or play badly when they came back, that would hurt the game. And because it wasn't as established in places like Melbourne and South Australia and Hobart and so forth, then yes, it was going to hurt the game. But what we find in Melbourne, for example, is that when players from the leading teams come back, they're very powerful, and the teams are very powerful. So there's a team from Footscray called Northumberland the Durhams, and they came back and they keep winning. And so in the Claremont team in Perth, similar story. They had 30 odd enlistments from their team, and they came back, and many of them were killed, but they were a powerful team until the mid 20s. And you think, well, that runs counter to that idea that it hurts the game. But in fact, what happens is these two teams both can disappear by the end of that decade. And what I figure, and we still can't make this claim for certain, is that what the war did was break up the development of these clubs, break up the infrastructural growth. And what we see with these clubs being really powerful just after the First World War is that's their last flicker. That's their last expression of strength. And then the clubs die. And that probably happens all around Australia. Not many of the clubs survived the war.
So, can you compare this to other football codes? Do we know how many were listed, how many died? Is this fairly unique to football? And if that's the case, do we know why?
My point is not that our game was special, our game was the best or anything like that. It's just not the case. But we were there as well. That's my point. The other games participated quite heavily. A lot of Australian rules players played, not first graders. Rugby league, perhaps not so much, not first graders, but players from all the codes participated. And for rugby union, they enlisted holers, bowlers. They all had to enlist. There was a sort of cultural imperative for them to enlist. And for example, in Brisbane, the rugby competition didn't restart until 1929. And you had teams called University and Grammar playing rugby league because they couldn't play. Rugby union was decimated, was smashed by the war. So if anybody wins that trophy, if that's a trophy that we want to talk about, it's probably rugby union. But, our game was there in terms of participation, very strong.
So, do we know why we didn't have a recovery unlike the other leagues?
Well, we did and we didn't. My book finishes in the 30s, where I look at it. It's a messy decade, the 30s. Sometimes it looks like the game's growing, sometimes it looks like it's shrinking, and it's hard to see. And then we get another war, right? And it's not until after World War II that football really starts to grow properly, especially with the incursion of continental European migrants, and the clubs start to grow and that they want to professionalise the game. They care more about professionalism than the old amateurists that we had before. The game doesn't really kick on properly until the 50s. And it changes its character. It's no longer a Pommy game or a Scottish game. It's now a European game. And there's resentment between both of those. This is a bit scurrilous what I'm about to say. Now, I'll only speak for myself, but there's a cohort of historians who probably agree with me that Sid Storey hid the ashes in his cupboard because he was afraid that the Europeans wouldn't respect it. So he hid it, and the interest in the national team and the competition against New Zealand dropped in the new community. Sid hid the trophy and went and died in the 60s. And it wasn't found until his grandson found it a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, or whatever.
So take us back to World War One. Do you know any of the specific stories and circumstances of any of the people which were players which fought and potentially passed away in World War One?
I could talk about these guys all day. I mean, perhaps the most famous within the game player is Judy Masters, or James William Masters, and they called him Judy. He was a coal miner, and he was a legend. He played for the Balgownie Club in Wollongong. He was basically headhunted by the Granville Club, and he joined up. When he came back, he kept Australia. He's one of the few players that has a biographical entry in the Australian Dictionary. Biography, for example. The Masters family, or the Masters name, you'd be aware of a journalist called Masters, wouldn't you? Roy Masters.
Yeah.
That's his. That's our Judy's great nephew, and so Roy Masters grew up in a soccer family, which is something that he doesn't admit that all that often. Although I do understand he was forced to admit it recently on a pod. So there's Judy. He was a coal miner. He was nearly killed in a coal mine accident. So he lived a hard life, and he was a little tough little man. Um, One of my favourite stories is Jeremiah Arthur Jennings, who was a Newcastle player. He played for Merriweather, and his name was Bull, as his nickname, Bull Jennings, and he was a good player in the region, and he joined up and he went and fought, on the Western Front, and when he was back in London, he played a trial match or a friendly match for Chelsea and scored a hat trick. And they asked him to stay, and he said, "No, I'm going back to Australia." Now, some people doubt this story. It's not necessarily a true story, but it's a story that was told by him when he got back. And he ends up playing in Sydney, and his final task was to be the groundskeeper at Cogra Oval. When Sydney and Newcastle played a few years back at Cogra Oval in the A-League, I contacted Andy Harper and suggested that this game should be called the Bull Jennings Derby, because he played for Newcastle, he played in Sydney, and he was the groundskeeper at Cogra Oval. There's Alexander Marr. He was a Fremantle Caledonian player, and he was a really strong figure in Western Australian football. He played for the Thistles team, the Caledonians team, and then he became a really important administrator. And there are medals named after him and so forth. So these are the sorts of people who were joining up. I've got some scandalous stories, but I'm not sure I want to reveal them. Venereal disease was very common among all soldiers in Egypt and wherever. And there's some fairly malicious or malignant people that were part of the soccer cohort, but that wouldn't be limited to soccer. Although the contemporary media would say that only soccer players were the malignant ones. I mean, the whole point of this project is to show how ordinary these guys are. They're just normal people in Australia. Many of them migrants, but many of them not migrants. 60% of the Newcastle list were native born. And here's a wacky stat for you. There were more people born in Victoria playing first grade in Western Australia than there were in Victoria just before the war.
It sounds like a brilliant piece of history that I think all of our listeners as well could definitely take a lot of pride in the history of Australian football.
Yeah, so we're pretty weak in some areas, much to my shame. We're weaker in Victoria, and that's my gig to do the bios for Victoria, but I'm too busy uploading everybody else's stuff. That's my excuse. Yeah, so soccer is ordinary. That's the point that I want to make in all of my research. which is not to say it's ordinary in that vernacular sense, which means kind of garbage. It means ordinary in that ordinary people do it. When you go to watch a game today, you go and see ordinary people playing. There's nothing weird about them, nothing special about them. Well, they're special insofar as they're the best players in the club, but there's nothing kind of strange or foreign about them. They're just Australians.
Ian, on the Christmas Day match between the Allies and was the Allies and the Central Powers, or I can't quite remember, the Christmas Day football game. Do you know if any Australians were participating in that game?
No, I don't. So it would be really relatively easy to find out, but I think that it was a very English thing or Scottish. It's one of those apocryphal stories too that might have kind of happened. And it's nice to think it did happen. But there's plenty of articles on it. There's plenty of essays on it that it's based on something that happened, but whether it was an organised game, maybe they used coats, those German helmets with the spikes on top.
If it's apocryphal, can we just add ourselves in there? Harry Cure's grandfather.
Oh, yeah, I think he was there.
Yeah,
Craig Johnson's grandfather too.
yeah.
Yeah, at least he played soccer for Australia.
So, in terms of Australian football involvement, now we did have, as you've said previously, we had quite a lot of people that went over, and we would have had these football games over there with the New Zealand national team. I actually do want to touch on this. Now, obviously, the Soccer Ashes, as you mentioned, sort of died out in the '60s. Do you reckon that that sort of rivalry with the New Zealand national team dying out that early, do you think that affected the growth of the game in any way for Australia and New Zealand, or do you reckon it didn't really have much of an effect because of the big immigrant populations?
May well have affected the growth of the game, but maybe the decline of the game affected the viability of the international game. I mean, it seems to me that the last time it was held was 54, and then there was no interest in it after that. But the game's getting stronger here all the while. But what's being left behind is that interest. Now, in terms of Australian and New Zealand troops playing, I haven't found many examples of that playing against each other. The examples I've found are mainly Australian battalions playing against other battalions or divisions against other divisions, or within a battalion, you've got companies playing other companies. Sometimes they play the locals, the local Belgian team or French team, and sometimes they play against English teams. About a year ago, I found a goldmine of information they're called war diaries, and every commanding officer had to keep a dated list of events. Whenever there was a game played, they listed what happened and they listed the scores. Sometimes they actually listed the teams who were playing and who played well and whatever. And so there's this fabulous database, nearly 500 games played, mostly on the Western Front, mostly between Australian teams. And you've got teams like the 34th and the 35th battalions, which represented Maitland and Newcastle. And when they played against each other, they played against each other with the spirit of a derby. We were playing against the enemy. And you look at the team lists, and I've found some team lists, and they're mainly first-grade players from Newcastle, from the Newcastle competition, from the Maitland team. So from Cessnock and Western, and playing against players from Adamstown and Merewether and so on.
That's incredible. So, if we could go to one of the toughest parts of the war, which is, of course, when so many Australians died at Gallipoli. I believe you've said elsewhere that 50 Australian soccer players died at Gallipoli. Do we know any of their stories or anything about them?
Well, look at the database. If you do a database search and type in Gallipoli, you'll find the ones that were killed there. So I'll do that now. 203 references to Gallipoli. Now that's not people who died. That's people who fought there. 64 killed in action. This depressed. Sometimes I just get depressed looking at this stuff. We've got Albert John Hyde. He played for Birmingham, Victoria. Albert John Hyde was born in April 1889 in Birmingham, Warwickshire. After the death of his parents, he migrated first to Sydney, then found his way to Victoria, where he played a starring role in the local game, whether for Club Birmingham, the England international team, or the Victorian state team. He enlisted very early in the war and served and was wounded at Gallipoli. He had a stellar military career and rose through the ranks, also being mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous gallantry and leadership. He was killed instantly near Ypres on the 4th of October 1917 when a shell hit him in the head. He was buried in West Flanders, Belgium. So he didn't die at Gallipoli. He fought at Gallipoli and then was transferred to the Western Front. So that's a typical story of someone who's killed. And the stories of people who are killed are often short. The Victorian stories are all short because there's no media, whereas Ipswich and Newcastle and parts of Sydney, the media is very strong on talking about whether they were footballers or not, or soccer players, or whether they, and when they were killed, they were glorified by the media. So, but in Melbourne, it's same old, hardly talked about it. For Footscray, where I live, and there's a historical centre here, the papers are a little bit more effusive about the local players, and they do talk about them being soccer players when it's appropriate.
Since I've emigrated out of Australia, I've basically observed Anzac Day every year because it's one of the most unique approaches to all the emotional complexity of war. Because we have people across an ideological spectrum, and including my family, I have people which fought on both sides of the war. I have people which you have pacifists in the family. You have people who are willing to sacrifice their life in the family, and some people and we've chosen a day which is Gallipoli, where so many died against someone who'd be our friend, an enemy which would be our friend Turkey, just a few years later, in a battle where there's no clear winner. And some people like to remember that and remember lost loved ones. Some people like to remember the courage and the bravery of those people. Others like to remember that war can be kind of futile, and some people like that hopeful message that today's enemy can be tomorrow's friend. Whatever it means to people at home, it means a lot to pretty much every Australian. And one thing which you said which really struck me was that they hid the trophy because they worried that we wouldn't respect what it meant. Could you speculate what they'd want the Soccer Ashes to mean, this trophy and also this event? Well, maybe not necessarily trophy, but the event to mean maybe to fans and to the players as we try and revive this tradition.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how we revive that, but it would be not, the international commitments work against us having an Anzac Day international, don't they? So we have to take it really seriously. We have to push it as a big deal game. If we could organise the A-League but it's finished by April, isn't it?
Depends on the season.
Yeah. So if we could organise the A-League to have a cross Tasman game on, April 25, I'm not sure how we revive it, and that's not something I'm very good at, thinking about marketing and it's.
Perhaps you could say personally, what do you feel with the way to history? Like how are you approaching the game?
Well, I think we need to take the history more seriously, but I say that, and I think that people who hear that think, oh, really? It's like, who cares about history? Let's move forward. And that's part of the problem. What I'm trying to do with this project, and what we're all trying to do with this project, is to make the point that first, that soccer is ordinary, and that we were there participating in arguably the most symbolically important event in Australian history in many ways, and for good and bad. Make that argument. And we don't have to make an argument about how soccer's not a foreign game, soccer's not a weird game. Soccer is just an Australian game. But that's different from your question. The question wants to know, how do we reignite the Soccer Ashes?
As someone who, Graham, similar to you, and I'm sure Ian, similar to you, as someone who has, surviving family members that have served in war and, had family members, distant family and close family that served in World War I and World War II. It's a very emotional topic for me, and I do appreciate and have this immense pride that the Anzacs are something that are so closely ingrained in Australian culture in all aspects of life. And that to me is truly beautiful. That is the embodiment of the Australian spirit, of the Anzac spirit, that it continues on and it is truly a never ending respect that we have for our ancestors and those that came before us that fought to give us, you know, everything that we have now. And, without the Anzacs, it's very likely that some of us would not be here having these same freedoms. And that, to me, is the embodiment of what the Soccer Ashes should be. It is all, to me, about respect. It is about respecting not only the Anzacs and the sacrifice and commitment they made to ensuring that we have, our safety and our freedoms, but also respecting the people that came before us in building the actual foundations to grow football, the greats of, Newcastle and the people that built up the game in WA and South Australia and Victoria, Tasmania, all around the country. And that to me is what the Soccer Ashes should be. It should be about paying respect to the deep and sometimes ignored history of football in this country, because it does run deep and the rabbit hole is a lot deeper than any of us could possibly imagine, or further than any of us could possibly dream to go down. And that is something that is special to me, and as it should be special to a lot of other people in this country who really do love football and want to see this game do well. And I'm hoping that with the Soccer Ashes coming back and us making it more of a traditional thing again and trying to revive this tradition, that we don't lose sight that this isn't just a friendly game. This is the embodiment, the sacrifice and the commitment that people not only made in both world wars and, wars before and after, but also the sacrifice and commitment that people made to actually building this game in this country that, came from Europe, sure, but it's here now and we love it now and we participate in it now. It's the biggest participated sport in the country. It has so much potential and we all want to see it do well. And that's what I think I would love to see with the Soccer Ashes, is just paying homage to those that came before us, and I guess just looking forward as to where this game can go from here.
We should take some sort of heart in the fact that Anzac Day was in decline in the 70s, and something happened to change that. Remember that song by Eric Bogle, the band played Waltzing Matilda? That was predicting the end of the Anzac Day march. But something reignited that, and some of the things that reignited it were not so positive, but some of the things were positive, but it happened. And so we can take confidence from that, maybe, that the Soccer Ashes can be reignited. We think about the international games played back in the day in the 30s. The media used to get right behind them. If Australia was playing England at anything, the media took an interest. And in the 25 tour, the media took a strong interest. They also took a strong interest in the games between Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Canada, for goodness sake, in the 20s. And now I don't think they do. Where's the big build up for the game against New Zealand in September? Where's the big build up? We've got to work out how to promote, how to operate media, whether it's social media or whatever, how to operate media to do that job of promotion and, and acknowledgement. Say in my book that, if you came from if someone came from a different planet and they read the Melbourne newspaper in the middle of winter, they wouldn't realise that soccer existed here. There's no indication that the game exists unless somebody's done some match fixing or someone's done, thrown a flare at a Hellas game or something. Soccer doesn't exist until that moment. And so we've got to work out how to make these things exist in a media form.
Well, perhaps one thing we can do is remember commemorate the clubs which still exists today, which had people serve in World War One. Could you list? You mentioned 11 in Newcastle. Are there any other ones around Australia which still exist today?
South Hobart, and Werner is going to hate me because I can't remember the ones that were going in Sydney. Granville was obviously around, and it exists in a kind of slightly different form today. Although I might be making a great mistake there. Balgownie in Wollongong, Woonona, these clubs are still they provided players. And the clubs there are 11 heritage clubs in in Newcastle, and they all provided players. Some clubs that have taken over the mantle of older clubs, like Minmay doesn't exist anymore, but one club has taken it over. The clubs I know, Cessnock, Western, Adamstown, Merewether. Yeah, I'm a bit weak on the other ones.
It's incredible history that we still have clubs today which have soldiers in World War One, and including in Gallipoli. So if you're from one of those clubs, please give us a shout or share some of your stories of your club and how it survived it as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Ian Syson, and please find him on socceranzacs.com.au to see the full database, which we've seen him demonstrate today, and hear some of those incredible stories. And as he said, this is not a foreign game. It's an Australian game. You know, everything about this game is Australian. It's a highest participation sport. We have Anzacs amongst our football players, which decimated our league. Of course, so many other codes experience that as well. We have that together. And it became a multicultural game as Australia became multicultural. And so this is the Australian game, and it's good to remember that as we remember the Anzacs this coming 2 matches against New Zealand. But thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. Don't forget we are on Twitter, Spotify, Apple, and of course YouTube. Please hit that like and subscribe button. But until next time, that's all we have time for. Is bye for now.